village. When the site was excavated, beneath these stones were found pottery from the Iron Age, which means that it was founded back 200, 300, 400 BC. These buildings, however, date from around about the 1st century AD, the beginning of the 1st century, and the occupation continued through until round about 400 AD. There is another site, Chaisausta, a few miles to the north. There, interestingly enough, the houses were built on a sort of cloverleaf design with a circular central courtyard and 3 or 4 circular rooms opening off them. And there's some debate as to whether the rooms alone were roofed and the central courtyard was open to the sky, or whether the entire structure was roofed, but in that case it would be a fairly substantial area to cover with wooden rafters and thatching. Here, however, there can be no question. The entire building was roofed. So we can imagine grass roofs soaring up 40 feet into the air at least, in order that the rafters could be joined at the top and cover this wide expanse. Here you just have one room opening off the central area. You can see it if I go along here. There's a single doorway into a long, narrow room, and this is it. So whether this was used as a private bedroom or more likely as storage, and out there was where the communal living took place, of course we don't know. Not sufficient remains were found. The baskets, the furniture had all vanished long before the archaeologists came here. But, as I say, most likely the central area was where all the living took place. And it's interesting that there is one doorway here and another one over there. 2 entrances into the building, both rather wide, large enough for cattle to be allowed in, if indeed they were allowed into that central space. And that may be what it was for. This room was big enough for a family, family of 5 or 6, and the central space was where they kept their animals. Now, let's go up and look at another one of these buildings. This one preserves a fascinating structure, unique to Cornwall. So here you have another of these circular houses. This house has a fine paved entrance, which must have been a great convenience when the weather was wet, as it so often is here in the southwest of England. This one is larger than that first one I showed you, and it has more rooms. There's a long narrow room going off in there, and then behind me you can see there's another room there with an entrance leading into a third room. But again, we have to assume that the entire structure was roofed with rafters and thatching. But it is over there that we have the most fascinating of all the structures, a fogou. Now, fogou is very similar to the Welsh word for cave, only the other way around, ogof. Fogou is the Cornish word for cave, and it is indeed a sort of cave, but a man-made one. The granite steps leading down into the fogou give you an indication of how much work went into building this structure. This wasn't just a hole in the ground cut on a whim. Furthermore, the fogou is high enough to walk into and still stand upright. Again, an indication that these stones were piled up with immense labour and a good deal of forethought. Unusually, this fogou has both an entrance and an exit, and both are tall enough to walk through, virtually standing upright. But there's a curious feature here. Can you see a patch of bright green glowing in the dimness of the fogou? This is some sort of lichen, luminescent, or just luminous. If you cast your shadow across it, it just goes back to dull green. But when light shines on it at a certain angle, it reflects the light back and positively glows in the dark. Even more curious, just near the entrance to the fogou, or maybe this was the exit, whichever way you want to look at it, there is this doorway. That isn't quite big enough to walk through with standing up. But the chamber in here is large and round and almost domed. It's closed at the top with 4 large menhirs. What purpose did it serve? Was it for storage? Underground you'd have a fairly equable temperature. Was this some sort of early attempt at refrigeration? We don't know. But I'll tell you what it does remind me of. And that is that down in Kent there is a Roman villa which was equipped with an underground chamber. Obviously the stonework was much finer than what you see here. But the underground chamber was for holding statues of the ancestors, busts of the ancestors of the family who lived in the house. And every so often the family would come down underground and would worship their ancestors. The busts of the ancestors were found in the villa and are now in the British Museum. At some point, the owner of the villa abandoned the worship of his ancestors and instead turned to the worship of Christ. Because the busts were taken down and carefully buried. Presumably because they were his ancestors, he didn't want to show disrespect to them. And then the walls of the underground chamber were plastered and covered with pictures of Christians at prayer, standing with their hands like this, which was apparently the way in which early Christians prayed. Is it possible that this underground room served a similar purpose? There's a niche in the wall over there which may be for ritual purposes. Archaeologists are fond of saying that things are ritual purposes, of course. If they can't explain it, well, it must be a ritual purpose. But it's possible that this chamber was where the community came together to worship their gods, dark gods of the underworld. Did the inhabitants of Carn Euny ever forsake their paganism and turn to Christianity? We don't know, but it is interesting that they abandoned the village when the Romans left. So obviously there was some close contact between the people of Carn Euny and the Romans. They depended on them for trade, for protection from enemies, for safety, or whatever reason, there was a connection. And by this time, by 400, the Romans were very largely Christian. So it's possible that down here too, the ancient gods were disposed of, and the room was turned over to Christian worship, or perhaps just refrigeration. We'll never know.